Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. So first, let me apologize. It has been quite some time since I have last produced any content. I have been away from my primary residence. I felt it was time that I needed to look at alternate locations. So many of you know that I live in the Midwestern United States. I live in a state that has rapidly become a bastion of far left-wing ideology. And based on that, I felt it was time to find another locale to have an alternate pathway to go live somewhere else if I needed to do that. And at the same time, this opportunity arose in terms of the alternate location is in the deep southeastern United States, very rural area, very nice area, very enjoyable area. The one thing that I can say that was really an eye-opener for me, and I think we as humans become conditioned to live in a certain type of an environment, right? And I can tell you that at a certain point in the state that I live in now, in the Midwestern United States, Colorado specifically, at one point there was a decision that was made within the Colorado state government that impacted quite a lot of people, and I'll just briefly touch on this. And again, you see all the normal left-wing insanity that you would see in other deep blue states, California, New York, and then here obviously in Colorado as well. But let's say, for instance, you go to a grocery store here in Colorado, and when you go to the grocery store, at one point, you would go through the grocery line, and they would bag your bags in either plastic or you could request paper. And it was fairly common that most people would just simply get the plastic bags. And again, this is just one nuance that is glaringly apparent when I compare and contrast here versus the alternate location that I have recently purchased and acquired. But again, you go through the grocery store here in Colorado, and you go grocery shopping. You buy your milk and eggs and all the other essentials for weekly and monthly life. And here in Colorado, they will not bag your groceries. You have to bring in your own bags, and you then must bag the groceries yourself. Now, not only that, is after you go through this tedious process of remembering to bring your own bags, and maybe you're washing your bags, because again, bags get nasty, right? I mean, they just do. And again, this was something that just fairly recently happened, where the Colorado state government waved its magic wand. There was no vote. There was no decision by the people to do this. It was just a wave of the magic left-wing wand, and no more bags. No more bags when you go through the grocery line. Now, furthermore, after you go through this grocery line, I can tell you that because of certain groupings, certain groups, right, another layer of security is required. So many items in these Colorado grocery stores are now locked down because there are groups that just cannot exist in a high trust society, or even, I don't even say a high trust society, maybe a medium trust society, right? It's gone, right? So these items are locked down, and then furthermore, when you leave the grocery store, there is a security guard, fairly decked out in paramilitary gear, armed, that then demands to see your receipt. And you know what's interesting is they can clearly see you walk through, because most everything is now self-checkout, right? So you go through the self-checkout line, you hopefully you remembered all your bags to bag everything, because you're doing the bagging and they're not going to give you any bags. And then you go through this process of where you then need to be inspected by a paramilitary type security guard to make sure that you're not stealing, right? Now again, keep in mind that security guard just observed you pay for everything through the self-checkout line, and that is something that is still required. Now, the alternate location. The alternate location is populated by groupings that don't have a tendency to go into a grocery or a department store and just steal stuff, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? You kind of getting it, right? Now, at this alternate location, that does not occur. I go pick up my groceries. I go through the grocery line. They bag my groceries. They put the groceries in a plastic or paper bag, whatever I want. They are placed in my basket, and I leave the store. Then I am not accosted by a paramilitary security guard believing that I may have stolen something, right? Remember a time in America where none of that occurred? None of that happened. Just didn't. Just wasn't something you had to worry about. And in some states, it's still like that. You don't have to worry about that. And not only that, it's much more, it's much deeper than just that one issue of having the ability to be inconvenienced at a grocery store. And, you know, on one side, you have the government telling you can't have any bags and you have to be inspected because they essentially have defunded the police services, and the police services are afraid to proactively go after the criminal element in society because they are worried about a civilian possible use of force panel, and the issue of the elimination of qualified immunity for law enforcement officers, right? So all that's gone here in the state of Colorado. It's very difficult to be a law enforcement officer and proactively go after these groupings of criminals. And it's usually the same grouping, if you know what I'm talking about. Wink, wink, nod, nod. It's the same. It's the same group, right? No high trust society, no medium trust society. Anyway, so out of the net for a bit, looking for the alternate location, found the alternate location, purchased the alternate location. Definitely deep red in the southern portion of the ununited states, and went ahead, pulled the trigger. Now I will spend time there as well as here. I'm still here, obviously, in the Midwest, but we'll probably eventually at some point depart for the permanent alternate location in the rural part of the deep southeastern United States. So we'll see how that goes. Now, look, again, it's been a bit of time since we've really deep dived into military affairs, military and foreign affairs, and I think, number one on the list right now is just watching this continued military fiasco that is taking place between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. I mean, we have gone into a conflict now that has lasted the better part of 5 years, right? Why is this happening? Why is this war continuing? Why hasn't the Russians fully applied themselves to this conflict and ultimately win? Because they've not made that decision as of yet to do so. Look, when you initiate military conflict, when you, and I don't want to say necessarily, let's say initiate, meaning you are the aggressor. When you decide to enter a state of armed conflict with a nation state, you really have to look at the nation state you are fighting, right? You have to look at the capabilities, you have to look at the pool of manpower, you have to look at the technology capacity of that nation state, you have to look at the industrial capacity of that nation state. And on the part of Russia entering the Ukraine, the eastern portions of the Ukraine, I do not believe it has done a very good job in analyzing what exactly was going to happen. When you make the decision to use massive military force and you call that military operation, let's just call it what it is. When you initiate and you go to war, right? You have to be prepared to go to war, especially when you are engaged in a nation state the size of the Ukraine. Okay? Tens of millions of people, again, a large military industrial base. And not only that, as the Russian leadership prepared for this operation, it has to understand that meaning the Ukraine, was going to be directly supported and sponsored by some very high-tech Western nation states. Look, as Russia, and you have to believe that the Russians, kind of going into this conflict, were aware that there was a very good chance that Western European nation states, such as the United Kingdom, such as France, Germany, the United States, was going to hand over some very advanced military equipment to the Ukrainians. And not only that, they had to understand that the Ukrainians were going to be directly supported in terms of intelligence, and real-time battlefield information. The Russians had to know this, right? And yet, I don't believe the Russians, again, if we look at 2022 compared to where we're at now, the Russians really analyzed this in a way that they could see worst case scenarios. Now, even after, let's say, a year of fighting, going into through 2022 and entering 2023, right? At that point, the Russians also knew that the Ukrainians were probably getting much more help than anyone could have really believed that was going to happen. And what do I mean by that? I'm just talking about weapon systems. Every possible weapon system has been handed over to the Ukrainians to help and assist the Ukrainians against the Russian Federation. And as the Russian military, prepared for this conflict, it had to understand, it had to know that at least if you look at the warfighting capacity of the West in terms of technology, okay? Like, let's take weapon systems, for example. Some of the precision-guided weapons that were handed over by the United Kingdom. Incredibly advanced missiles with millimeter wave radars. I mean, just incredibly advanced pieces of equipment. Drones. All kinds of battlefield technology that, let's just say it is ahead of a lot of the technology that the Russians were fielding, right? I mean, going into this conflict, most Russian aircraft, and I've talked about this before, Russian strike aircraft, did not have the same kind of long-range strike capacity, especially in regarding to targeting pods. The targeting pods and having that ability to have these high-resolution thermal imaging targeting pods that can direct these long-range weapon systems were simply not available to the Russians. If you look at the Su-24 and the Su-34, more obviously the more advanced Su-34 fullback, again, way behind in terms of advanced technology. Now, look, I understand Russia has its own doctrine, and it believed that doctrine, in terms of, look, if the Russians wanted to strike a certain point, they could, and they would. But again, the technology that was handed over to the Ukrainians, in some cases, was far better technology than what the Russians were actively using. If you look at the use of some of the anti-tank guided weapon systems, such as the Javelin and a host of other weapon systems as well, again, more, fire and forget were absolutely more advanced than what the Russians were fielding. And then we kind of segue into the whole concept of drone warfare and the FPV drone, the vaulted FPV drone, either radio or fiber optically guided, right? Those systems. And those systems have fundamentally transformed the way war is being fought right now in this conflict. And I got to tell you, just myself, right? when I was in the military, I was in an armored unit in the early 90s. Okay? And at that time, war was, for the most part, in terms of armored maneuver warfare and the whole concept of how war would be fought in the 90s, was not too far off from what things look like during World War II. I mean, obviously, technology has progressed. The ability to utilize satellites and other systems to sense large-scale enemy movement was something that wasn't present during World War II. It had to be done through other means, human intelligence, what have you, right? So that pace was slower, obviously, from World War II to the 90s. But where we sit now, in terms of what war looks like and the ability to sense and then shoot and that kill chain, has sped up or increased beyond comprehension. If you look at what is happening now on the battlefield, right? If you watch what is happening, and obviously there's lots of content out there, you can kind of see how the Russians are fighting, how the Ukrainians are fighting, and what is happening. It is quite literally, at least for me, if you compare and contrast, I think we're getting to the point that, let's go back to the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s, right? If you were to go back to the 1860s and bring a general, you were to bring Nathan Bedford Forrest or General Grant or General Sherman or Robert E. Lee, and you were to bring them to a World War II era battlefield, obviously they're going to be shocked and they're going to be, wow, war has dramatically changed. And the biggest thing for them would be the use of, obviously, air power and the mobility of tanks and armored vehicles, right? Now, if we go from World War II up to the 90s, and then we kind of end up where we're at now in terms of what war looks like, I would say you're not too far off in terms of that gap. Because what I see on the battlefield, in terms of how the movement to contacts are being done with these incredibly small units, because you can't utilize large-scale troop movements because they are instantly identified and almost instantly attacked with a high degree of lethality. So, again, for me, looking at what's happening now, it's challenging for me. Because, again, we've entered a realm that I've not fought in. I don't have that experience to really understand what war looks like and what guys are experiencing now compared to what we experienced in the early 90s. Vastly different, almost to the point where that separation between the 1860s and the 1940s. It's changing that dramatically. And it is quickening, right? Especially with the use of artificial intelligence. We're going to enter a phase where the battlefield is going to become so lethal for human beings that you may not see humans on the battlefield in the very near future. Now, the question then arises, how do you win a war? How do you win these future-facing wars? If machine is fighting machine, what happens next? How do you get an adversarial nation state to capitulate? And I think I have an answer for that. And I've talked about this a little bit before. The opposing force, the Op 4, not just the military, the civilian populace, the civilian government needs to understand that they have been defeated. How do you do that? Well, I think we're seeing the early stages of that process right now. Now, it's not being implemented to the extent, in some cases, where it will achieve total victory. Case in point, Iran versus the United States and Israel, right? What are we seeing in this conflict? Well, we are seeing the ability of the United States and the Israelis to go after and kill the senior leadership of an adversarial nation state. Now, the component that is missing to ultimately achieve full-on victory is that you have to make the adversarial nation state population and its leadership understand it has been defeated. And that's going to take doing things and conducting types of operations that bring the war home to the adversary. That's being done to some extent in this current conflict with Iran, but not completely. Not completely. The Iranians have not yet come to the thought process that they have been defeated. And again, that is going to take ruthless kinetic activity to bring that to the Iranian capital and other cities. It's just the way wars is heading right now. And at the same time, you can say the same for the war that has taken place between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. Right? In order for Russia to win this conflict, it has to enforce its will on both the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian state, and the Ukrainian civilian population. All three of these organizations and entities need to understand that they have been defeated and face the full firepower and brute force of the opposing nation state. Is that being done right now? No, it's not. It's not. And again, we've entered this new type of war where we are not seeing wars of maneuver. We are not seeing the encirclement of enemy corps and divisions and the destruction of enemy corps and divisions, at least in terms of what we understood war to be 20, 30 years ago. So unless you go after the industrial capacity, the ability of let's say the Ukrainian civilians to maintain warmth in the winter and normal everyday activities such as obtaining food and what have you. And again, we're talking about total war, right? I mean, that's what we're looking at. You can't fight and win the type of war that is being executed right now, specifically between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And you know, the Ukrainians are doing the same thing. The Ukrainians are attempting to cause pain, right, to the Russian economy, to the Russian fuel industry, to some extent, it's the Russian ability to project military capacity against the Ukraine, right? They're doing that, but again, not on the scale that's required for ultimate victory. Look, if you want to fight a forever war and fight for, you know, wars that last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, I mean, both sides, the Ukrainians, Western Europe, and the Russians are on pace right now to have that kind of war. But the question is, does Russia want to win this conflict, this war? It's not a special military operation. It is a war. And when you enter into armed conflict, when you enter into war with an adversarial nation state the size and scope of the Ukraine, with the support that the Ukrainians are receiving, you have to make the Ukrainians understand they have been defeated. And the Russians have not yet done that. And I haven't seen, as of yet, that full-on mobilization that will be required to ultimately, for the Russians to win this conflict outside of fighting a 6 to 10 year war of attrition that could be successful. But I have to ask myself, you know, is it really worth it for the Russians? If the Russians would have fought the first 6 months against the Ukrainians and then at a certain point reached the conclusion, look, hey, this is going to go on forever. And in hindsight, if the Russians could look back in 2023 and say, okay, do we fight for 6 to 10 years, or do we take the country into full-on mobilization and prepare for total war, the likes of which was seen during World War II, during the Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany? And I think, in retrospect, if the Russians would have conducted a full-on mobilization, and again, I don't believe the Russians did a very good job of preparing the country for the onset of high-intensity war. That was never done. And as we watch this conflict now, the Russians are attempting to win this through attrition and not fully applying themselves to defeat the Ukrainians in total. Now, I would say that on the flip side of the coin, the Ukrainians are probably doing a better job in terms of how they have mobilized their military, and they are, I would say, more focused on ultimate mobilization to fight a full-on total war scenario against the Russians. So you have the Ukrainians doing that, but you have the Russians, again, they just have not, at least as far as I am concerned and what I can see, they have not fully committed themselves in a manner that would achieve victory. And look, as we watch this conflict, achieving victory for the Russians is going to take more kinetic, brutal force. Again, when you enter into a state of war with a nation state the size of the Ukraine, okay, tens of millions of males. I think at the beginning of the conflict, you were looking at 30, 40 million people. What that looks like now with people leaving, difficult to say. But this conflict is not like entering in a state of conflict against the Chechens. Okay? Much different. Much different. In terms of national capability and more, even more importantly, the support from Western Europe that is actively being applied to the Ukrainians. And ironically, if we look at what is happening between Iran and the United States, if we look at that, the United States is kind of playing the same game. Again, not fully committed itself. Look, when you attack and you conduct the type of military operation that the United States did at the start of this conflict, decapitation strikes, a massive aerial campaign, look, you are at war. Now, I understand the United States doesn't want to place boots on the ground, and I get the United States does not want to enter Iran with large numbers of ground forces, and I don't believe the United States would need to do that. But the United States does need to induce enough, let's just call it what it is, brutal kinetic force against the adversary to where the adversary understands that it has been defeated. Even if you're taking islands in the Persian Gulf, and you hear the War Department and the leadership at the White House talk about going after Iranian bridges and power plants. Well, look, that should have already occurred, right? Again, once you launch the type of operation the United States has launched against the Iranians, the Iranians are not stopping. And the only way to make them capitulate, okay, talking's over with. I mean, you've killed layers of their senior leadership, and the leadership is fragmented, and some elements are wanting to fight and are fighting, some elements are not. Again, you have to establish your dominance and your will over your opponent. You have to militarily defeat, again, the military, the political leadership, and the civilian base needs to understand that they have been defeated. You have to take that conflict to all three of those elements. And the United States has not really done that as of yet. They've done it to a significant portion of the Iranian military. They've done it to some extent to the Iranian leadership. But again, if you're going to win a war, the enemy has to understand that it's been defeated. And again, you have to hearken back to World War II, right? The Japanese finally understood that they had been defeated. How was that done? Well, ultimately it took, firebombing cities and the use of nuclear weapons. It took the use of nuclear weapons and firebombing most large Japanese cities. That's what it took to induce surrender and capitulation. Same thing with the Allies against the Germans in World War II. It took millions of Soviet troops and tank armies crushing the German military and entering the capital, while at the same time, from the West, German cities were being firebombed and destroyed. The German population understood it had been defeated. It was hopeless. As did the military, as did the German leadership eventually. But that whole concept of war, none of that has changed. Humans are still the same. But when you fight these kind of limited, protracted wars, you're entering a realm where, in all probability, the adversarial nation state you're fighting, if you're fighting that kind of limited conflict, ultimately you may not win. You may not win. Or you're going to extend the war much longer through a war of attrition that may or may not end. I mean, your population, even if you have a military advantage, a significant military advantage over your adversary, if you fight a half-ass conflict, it's possible that your civilian population will turn against the government, will turn against the war effort if you do not fully commit yourself. So again, in all probability, look, if the Russians would have fully mobilized and fully prepared and fully understood that this was going to be a serious conflict requiring the participation of the entire country to win this conflict, especially when you bring Western nation states and the high-tech capability that the West is bringing into this conflict, you have to do that if you're Russia. If you're Russia. And again, the same thing, essentially the same thing is happening right now between the United States, Israel, and the Iranians. So look, it's good being back. More to come, obviously, very, very soon. Look, we're also watching what is happening in the eastern portions of Africa. We're watching Tigray, we're watching Eritrea, we're watching Ethiopia. I don't think at this point that it is, and again, you have to look at this from, war is expensive, okay? War is costly, especially now. The cost of war, and if you are looking at purchasing, obviously advanced military hardware that you don't have the ability to produce, it's expensive. And I don't think at this point, if you watch what's happening on the ground in terms of just how distressed the government and how fractured Ethiopian society is at this point, that it would be viable for the Abiy loyalist military to launch a new military campaign into Tigray, and especially if the scenario has changed where Eritrea could now be supporting the Tigrayan Defense Forces. I just don't think the financial wherewithal and ability is present right now for this conflict to reignite, the likes of which we saw previously. Now, I could be wrong on that. It could fire up and that could happen. But again, war is costly, and you just can't acquire military equipment the way one would, let's say, during the Cold War. It's just not going to be handed to some of these nation states. They have to raise capital and they have to purchase these weapon systems, and it's expensive. And then obviously the human capital as well, and the impact on the economy. So obviously things are tense and fighting continues, but are we going to see a renewed all-out war? Difficult to say at this point. But look, we're going to continue to watch and comment and bring you more commentary as well. So as always, thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Good day.